All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is now 3 p.m. here in Germany. Thank you, everyone, for joining and welcome to the webinar. While a few participants are still joining us, we will start the webinar today. Today, we're going to cover Vienna, the capital of Austria, and its sustainable mobility policies. Let me give you a first overview of the agenda. So today with me is Friedemann Brockmeyer, our esteemed presenter. He's a partner at Civity Management Consultants, and we'll be handing over for the main presentation to him very shortly. Hello, Friedemann. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here today.
And thank you to everyone else in the audience joining us today. We hope you're all safe and sound during these special times. And we're delighted you're joining us for the webinar series Mobilize Minds. I'm Linus. I work for GIZ and TUMI, that's the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative. And apart from this webinar series, let me just give you a quick overview of other events coming up. So in about 2 weeks, we have our first fully virtual conference, TUMI TV, especially focused on the response of the transport sector to the coronavirus pandemic. And we'll go live on that Tuesday in 2 weeks. You're all invited to join. You can just go to our website that day and you'll be able to join all the discussions, meet thought leaders from all around the world, and watch what's presented to you and interact with presenters and the audience. I also want to point your attention to our COVID-19 observatory that we've launched. So it's basically just our website /corona. Here you find all information within the framework of Avoid, Shift, Improve, organized, as well as useful guidelines for transport companies, the specific impact on gender and women, that the virus presents, as well as an overview of other webinars and knowledge products that you might be interested in. So particularly for this week, we have another round of webinars coming up. On Friday, there will be a talk on the focus of the pandemic on women specifically. There's more webinars on pop-up bike lanes and tactical urbanism. And there's today's webinar, which will focus on the city of Vienna. So we have about 80 participants now online. And with this, I'll hand it over to Friedemann.
Okay, thank you. And I will share my presentation with you in a few moments. Seconds. So that's it. I hope everybody can see my slides. Good afternoon from Berlin. My name is Friedemann Brockmeyer. As Linus has mentioned already, I'm a partner with Civity Management Consultants. It's a boutique strategy consultancy from Berlin, Germany. And we are focused on the public transport industry in Europe. And one of our key clients is the transport operator of Vienna, and we are advising them for a long time. And this is a story about Vienna. And of course, Vienna is a very rich capital, and as I understand this webinar correctly, many of the participants are from emerging and developing countries, and not every lesson learned from Vienna can be translated one-to-one to other cities. But what we can learn from Vienna is, and this is very important, is what is good governance in public transport and what is long-term planning, and why long-term planning is so much important for public transport, for successful public transport strategy. We have now, I guess, 20-25 minutes for the presentation, and afterwards I'm very happy to get in a discussion with you, to answer your questions and to acknowledge your remarks. So let's start me. Why is Vienna so successful? As I have started my career in public transport, everybody was looking to Singapore, to Switzerland. What were the lighthouses of public transport? But for, I would say now, 6 or 7 years, Vienna is the lighthouse for the success of public transport. And this reason, the reason behind this success story is really a long-term strategy. And I think you can see that on this slide very, very impressively. It started a long time ago, 2 decades ago, in the early 90s. Vienna started with a modal share of 29%. That's already quite high if you compare that with other Western European cities at the same size. But when we had this impressive increase of public transport, up to 40% around the year 2013, 2014. And this story is really a success story because it was combined with a decrease in the usage of motorized individual transport, so a decrease of private car. Unfortunately, where we have no tableau situation, so we're a little bit in a steady state situation since 3 or 4 years. And we will go into that later on detail, what could be the reason behind. But first of all, Vienna is the most impressive success story for a Western European industrialized city where you can find really a ramp up in public transport usage. And why that happened? And the first thing is, here's another slide. So if you compare to other cities, and these are the best cities where you can compare Vienna, because these are cities from Germany, and you have to know that the public transport system in Europe is quite simple to distinguish. First of all, you can say there are classical European cities where you have a conventional public transport system, and then you have a very specific situation of public transport in German-speaking countries. It's mainly based on different organization of transport structures and so on. We have not the time to go into that in detail, but let's state this here as a premise. And what we can see is, and that's very important, that Vienna has far the highest share of public transport at a modal share. If you compare to the Hamburg, for example, it's a city of the same size in terms of inhabitants. You can see that in Hamburg, public transport is much smaller than in Vienna. And you can see the same, for example, for other cities. And you can see there's a much higher share of motorized individual transport. Let me make a small remark to the Hamburg graphic. There's a mistake that 22% are public transport and 36% are motorized individual transport. Yeah, sometimes happen this. You can see this dark brown part of the piece is public transport, and this light brown is motorized individual transport. But you can also see, and this is a little bit the downside of the story of Vienna, if you compare to Munich, you can see that public transport is also very impressive in Munich. But on the other hand, you can see that, for example, in Vienna, the share of cycling is quite low if you compare it to the German cities. And this is really a downside of a successful public transport strategy, because public transport is really a substitute to some extent to cycling. This is also an important lesson learned we already see from Vienna. But why is Vienna so successful? And the first and most important reason is the exceptionally high settlement density in Vienna. Here again, compared to these 4 German comparators, you can see that, for example, as I've mentioned already, that Hamburg has more or less the same number, same amount of inhabitants than Vienna, but the density in Vienna is much higher. And if you can see this picture, you see there are always for each city 2 bars. The first bar is the settlement density, the actual settlement density of each city, and the second bar is the calculated settlement density, the calculated number of inhabitants based on the settlement density of Vienna. So let's assume that for the size of the city of Hamburg, that Hamburg would have the same settlement density than Vienna, then 3.4 million people have to live on the same land cover than in Vienna. That means that the density is much higher in Vienna than in other cities, and so it's much easier to address people with public transport. And we can see this later on, because that this is also very important if you want to use, for example, rail-bound public transport. Here's another illustration where you can see that Vienna has not only a high settlement density, and it's not only easier to address people with public transport. Vienna really uses this advantage, and we can see on the x-axis, and we call it the departures per square kilometer settlement area, and on the y-axis the departures per station. And so you can interpret the x-axis as an indicator for the as an indicator for how we the quality of the not only the quality, you can see as an indicator for which part or how large is the share of addressable public transport uses, and the y-axis as an indicator for how good is the quality of public transport. And in both dimensions, Vienna is at the northeastern part of the portfolio, but in the language of consultants, that means this is really the sweet spot. That means they are in the best situation. If you compare to other cities, Vienna is far, far beyond the quality and the addressability of other large German cities. And this is also combined again, and if you combine that with settlement density, you can see how many inhabitants, or how is the population of Vienna addressed or covered by public transport. And we have always two figures. The first one is the global addressability of public transport, and the addressability of a population, and the second one is the addressability of the land cover of each city. And here you can see again that we have quite impressive figures from Vienna. We have 74% of all people live close to very, very close to a public transport station, while in Hamburg, for example, as a negative example, it's only 31%. And so this is really based on a much better settlement structure, where it has a higher public transport affinity and a better public transport supply. And this is really the consequence why it's so easy to use public transport, and why public transport as a whole is very, very competitive in Vienna. Let me move forward. What we can also see is that public transport supply, and that's the whole story around long-term planning, that public transport supply since 2006 up to 2017, so in one decade of public transport planning, has led to an increase in public transport supply by 31%. And if you again compare that to other German cities, not to other German-speaking cities, then you can see this is also far, far beyond what best practice cities in Germany, for example, Munich, has achieved with 22%. This is already really high. But if you compare, for example, with Cologne, which is also from the overall city structure, it's a monocentric city, it's a quite old city, it's quite comparable with Vienna, but there's also there's a very, very small increase in public transport. So a completely differentiation in political objectives and different consequences. So in Vienna, we can summarize up to this slide. We have better structures which favor public transports. We have an overall better addressability of population and land cover. And we have also very important political support in advancing public transportation by increasing public transportation demand year by year. And this leads to an increase on the public transport supply side by 31% in 1 decade. This is quite impressive for Western European city. And there's also another story, and that's very famous, especially in German-speaking countries. This is the famous 365 annual pass. They call it the so-called Jahreskarte. That's very easy because it's a good political instrument. It's easy to communicate. 365 euro means €1 per day, and that's easy to communicate. And they have introduced this annual pass in 2012. It was demanded by the Green Party of Vienna. They entered the city government one year prior to the introduction in 2011, and it was a reduction of the annual pass ticket, the annual pass price by €449 to €365. It's not that important discount. It's more a political important price. And there's the overall story or legend that this annual pass has led to this increase in public transport demand and to this quite surprising success story. But as you already have learned, that the success of public transport in Vienna is based on long-term planning, as we have seen on the slide before. We can see here now the sales side of this famous annual pass, and this is quite impressive, to be honest. We have an increase by 122% from 2011 to 2018. So they have doubled the sales of the annual pass from close to 400,000 to close to 900,000 annual passes in Vienna. That means for two inhabitants, 1 annual pass. That means 50% of all inhabitants in Vienna have such an annual pass in their wallet and can use public transport at any time. And this is something very typically for German-speaking countries, that public transport in German-speaking countries is much focused on this annual pass strategy, or the so-called subscription strategy. The idea behind that is to have an open public transport system where everybody has an annual pass or a subscription in the wallet and can use public transport without any gates at any time. We have seen the success side of the annual pass, and as I already mentioned, is quite impressive, with doubling the sales of annual passes within 5 years. But there's also, to be honest, a downside, because selling annual passes doesn't mean automatically the increase in public transport ridership. We can see this here on this slide on the right side. At the top of the right side, you can see this impressive increase in the sales of annual passes. You can see below this the most important tickets beside the annual pass. It's the monthly ticket, it's a weekly ticket, it's an 8-day ticket, and it's a single ticket. And what we can see with the introduction of the annual pass, the sales in monthly tickets has decreased by 64.7%. It's an enormous reduction. If you know that this monthly ticket was a quite important ticket prior to the introduction of this very cheap annual pass. We have seen the same with the weekly tickets. There's also a reduction by more than 50%. And then there's this very famous 8-day ticket. It's a so-called Mehrfahrtenkarte. It's something special I know with special ticket also only from German-speaking countries. You can stamp these tickets in the tram or in the underground station, and then you can use them for this specific stay. They have dropped by 72.6%. This is very important to know, because this ticket was bought by many public transport users which use public transport specifically for leisure trips or at weekends. So what this introduction of the annual pass has increased is especially it has transformed irregular, or it has transformed non-frequent travelers to annual pass holders. So it's not only for attractive annual. In most German cities or most German-speaking cities, annual passes are very attractive for commuters. In Vienna, we now have a situation, it's really attractive for everybody. And we have also seen that the single tickets have decreased by 23%. That's not that high in comparison to monthly tickets and weekly tickets, because single tickets are mostly bought by tourists and people which are not residents of the city of Vienna. Another part of the story is, and we have to be very honest with that, is the story about parking management. And this is also very important, because we have not only an excellent situation in public transport, easy communication, easy tariff, an easy fare, public transport fare system, which is easy to communicate and easily to understand. We have also at very attractive site conditions, because the annual pass was not a single political instrument, it was part of a wider package. And with this wider package in 2012, Vienna has introduced a new fare zone and has increased parking revenues by 149% from 2012 until 2018. And you can see this here. On the left side, you see the managed parking areas, the so-called curbside parking areas in 1995. This is very close around the old medieval city of Vienna, close to the Hofburg, really the inner city center, the so-called first district. And I'm sorry, it was one step too fast. And on the right side, you can see the managed curbside parking space in 2018, and with the addition of this so-called district of Döbling in 2019. They have increased the managed parking spots from 27,500 to 299,800. So that means they have 10 times more managed parking space in 2019 than in 1995. And again, if you compare this with other German-speaking cities, this is all again quite impressive. And as we have done on the slides before, if we took Vienna as a best practice, let's have a look into Hamburg, where we have managed managed streets, or the managed street kilometers of curbside parking spots are close to 6%, while it's in Vienna 39%. So this is again a reason why public transport is so much more attractive in Vienna, as you can see, for example, in Hamburg. And that's very important, because we have this increase in parking management fees, and we can use this increase by parking management fees by 56% to subsidize public transport. We use this money to, and a large part of subsidizing this very cheap annual pass flows directly from this increased revenues from parking management in Vienna. So we have increased parking management revenues close to 200%. And again, if you compare this to other cities, here you can see this. These are the different income streams for parking. The first bar is around, this is regular parking tickets, then you have penalties, and then you have a special annual pass for residents. And through all bars, we can see there's a much higher revenue from parking in Vienna than in other German-speaking cities. This is 5 times as high as we can see here. So, and let's summarize this at this place, and let's say what we can learn from Vienna, and this is very important, is not to copy the instruments one-to-one, to introduce a 365 euro ticket overall. What we can learn from Vienna is really we need a dedicated settlement policy. We need high settlement density, and this is really a question of long-term planning in Vienna. And because if we have such a high settlement density, it's much easier to address people with public transport. And if you have such a high settlement density, when introduce a public transport system which is addressing the people and offers constant and high quality in public transport on the public transport supply side. And we need also a long-term planning strategy that leads to a significant increase on the public transport side each year. This was 1/3 over the time of a decade is quite high, but it is really it's sufficient enough. It's at least sufficient enough to stabilize public transport demand. And if you have done all this good and the best thing, then you have really to think about the right conditions at the site. And this could, for example, of course, could it be a congestion toll or something else? What we have learned is the best way to do that in cities is to manage parking space and to make parking more expensive and make it in more areas of the cities more expensive, because this has 2 effects, or to be honest, it has 3 effects if you use the money correctly. First of all, it gives an advantage to public transport. So it leads a little bit to more truthness about costs, because there are definitely opportunity costs for parking. It leads to a situation where you can use the money and to cross-subsidize, for example, very attractive and easy to communicate annual passes. And on the third hand, you can use this parking management system to free public space from the usage for transport, and you can use it for different things. And that's also very important in Vienna, because now we are starting to reduce parking spots and to use this area for public space for different activities you can have around streets. We have a much more detailed story is available. You can find them on our webpage if you're interested. Unfortunately, the study is until now available only in English, but maybe if you look on our homepage in a few weeks, there will be also an English copy available. Yeah, until then I can say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to hear. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm waiting for your questions and remarks. Thank you for attention. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Platzer. Oh, yeah.
So, thank you, Friedemann. Perfect timing. So we are half an hour into our webinar now, and we have already received a number of questions, and we'll be happy to address them. Friedemann, maybe to start off with, You've talked a lot about the comparison between Vienna
Yep.
and German cities, and then different policies. One question was, how did this story of the success in Vienna start? What time frame are we talking about, and what would you advise to other cities, maybe in the global south, if they would like to start to follow the Vienna example?
So the story started already in the 70s. There was a turning point in the public transport strategy, and was an introduction of the underground system. They had a quite impressive legacy system already from the time of the Austrian Hungarian Empire, but until the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, there were no improvement in public transport on the supply side. But in the 70s, they've decided to build a new underground system. And since then, we are constantly building new underground lines, and they are quite now. We are starting to build the most impressive line. It's a U5. It will be the first fully autonomous line in Vienna. And so you can see this is a long-term story, and this is, as I say, it's all about long-term planning. You need a big picture for the future, and you need a lot of time to get these things done. Maybe in emerging countries, this could be faster. Of course, in Austria and Germany, we need much more time for planning. It has a lot to do with our administrational staff and all the regulations we have. That could be easier. What you can learn in the global south from Vienna is, and as I've tried to state this in the beginning, it's not that you have to introduce a 365 euro annual pass or to build an underground line. That's not the story. It's really to be honest, and to say this is not an quick win. To gain public transport demand shares is not a quick win. It needs a lot of time. It needs decades. That's the first one. And the second one is you need constant and good practice in public transport governance. So you need a mostly constant system. And this was also part of the story. We have very few changes. We have quite autonomous working public transport operators which have implemented this long-term planning strategy, and it was really focused on public transport. This is the second one. And the third one is we have to think about regulating private car. And this is for me, this is the most important lesson learned. You can do all the stuff right about public transport. You can increase public transport. You can do the right things about settlement density. But if you are not regulating private car and reducing public parking spots, then it's quite difficult to utilize public transport. So we need both slices. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And since you mentioned it, so shaping public transport demand. There were a few questions here from Christian and from Marcin, who were wondering what's the cost recovery rate of the changes in ticket distribution. So did the city gain more money, and both through the change in the fare pricing, but also how much of percentage of, is there a tiered percentage of the money gained from the changed parking management that goes directly to the public transport budget?
Okay. Yes, I've missed the slide, I see. To be honest, there's no gain in public transport revenues, of course not. If you reduce public transport prices, if they are not too high, you will not gain any further revenues. It's a loss by around 50 million euros. So, and that's fit very well with additional revenues from parking management. But the city has to spend a lot more money for the system. They had received before the introduction of the 365 euros from the users. And that was really a difficult situation. It was a conflict in the city government, to be honest. But I think now we have a situation that not everybody's happy with this 365 annual pass, but nobody has the ability, I would say, to change it, because it's 365 you cannot change. Maybe if you change the number of days per year, then you can change the price, and we all know that would never happen. So this is quite fixed, but it's really a problem. The cost coverage, of course, the cost coverage of public transport in Hamburg is much higher than in Vienna, but that's simple to see, because they have an annual pass is close to 1,000 euro per year, and they have less underground public transport. They have a lot of bus transport. It's quite cheaper. So if you look into all, in the overall, we have a very small cost coverage in Vienna. I would say it's less than 50%.
Okay, and you mentioned the discussion around this, the framing of the 365 euro ticket. So from your perspective, it kind of creates a lock-in for the city on
Sure.
on communicating this fare. Has there been discussions in Vienna, or have you seen other cities adopt this, or even go further in terms of making public transit available to all citizens, or a subgroup of citizens for free?
For free? Sure, we have in many cities, we have for free tickets for students and for pupils, especially here in Berlin, for example. What we can see is that all cities which have this 365 annual pass, now all larger cities of Austria have such an annual pass. We will never change from that. Nevertheless, more than that, the national government, now the Greens are also in the national government, they are planning to introduce a new ticket, the 1,095 euro ticket. It means €3 per day, and it's an annual pass for the whole country. They not only can use Vienna, but they can use public transport in the whole country. But this is not solved, because there are also ongoing discussions, as you can imagine, because this means again a large loss in revenues, because there are also commercial operators in long distance rail operations involved, and this is complicated, especially with EU law and so on. But this would be too much information for this webinar. Mm-hmm. We have no time.
Okay, but yeah, but thank you for illuminating on the further ramifications of this 365 euro ticket on the national side. Maybe shifting to other policies than just the ones focusing on public transport, and seeing the overall picture that you said makes Vienna so attractive for everybody. There were quite a few comments from Alexander and from Marie and John also that referred to the role of cycling. They noticed that the cycling share is quite low comparably in Vienna. Yeah. How can this be a success? And maybe adding to that, when we look at the share of the modal share of cars, has this really gone down, just in relative terms, or also in real terms?
First question. So this is really the downside of this public transport strategy. If public transport is too cheap and the supply side is too good, cycling is losing market shares. And this is also something you have to learn from Vienna. You have to decide what's your priority. It's public transport overall, or it's the we call it the so-called Umweltverbund in Germany, or in the German language. It means the environmental the association of all environmentally friendly transport modes. That means cycling, walking, public transport, and that's really the story about that. And of course, if you're looking into the topography of Vienna, Vienna is not designed for cycling, to be honest. It's close to the Alpine mountains, the Wiener Wald. But with the pedelecs, for example, or e-bikes, it's much easier to cycle. But there is no success story in cycling in Vienna until today. And part of this wider transport policy package in 2012 was not only parking space management and the €365 annual pass, it was also an impressive investment program for cycling lanes. And we've introduced a lot of cycling lanes, but it has not supported cycling until today impressively. We can see a very small increase, I guess, from 6 to 7%. That's not bad overall, but it's on the other side, it's obvious, because public transport is so cheap and is so good condition, you have no need to cycle.
Okay.
And the second question was about, I'm sorry about that.
Whether there was a shift in the modal share of cars, both relative and absolute.
Absolutely, relatively, yeah, sure. Fortunately, both, until a few years ago, especially if you compare it into the inner city districts. So Vienna is based on 23 districts, and the lower numbers are the inner city districts and the higher numbers are the outer city districts. And in the inner city districts, you have seen both. You have really seen a reduction in private car usage. Unfortunately, especially in the last years, we have an increase in private car usage in the outer city districts. Yeah, it's unfortunate. And of course, overall, we have an increase in public transport demand, not in public transport demand. So that we have for a few years already, yeah, really an increase in private car usage, but really with a special focus on the outer districts.
Okay, yeah, and that of course also goes with the parking management there. So just if this was a multiple choice question, and you said like, okay, in order to boost the public transport, would you focus on, for example, for a city like another capital in the world, for maybe not Bogota, but another capital, would you focus on increasing demand or increasing supply? Or as some participants have wondered, would you focus on improving the last mile connectivity, the interconnectivity, or would you start with the density planning?
I would start with the density planning. So that's
okay.
the first of all. We could have a long discussion. Yeah, I agree, a very easy one. It's the first important, because you need most time for density planning. The first important one is your settlement strategy, and you cannot think about transport not thinking about your settlement policy. You need a settlement policy which is clearly transit oriented, or at least cycling oriented. That's also fair. And then you have to think about which city do you want to have. It's a city where it's a green city where you can use a car everywhere, like Houston or some other cities in the southern US. That makes sense. If you're a rich country, you have unlimited access to fuel, space is not scarce, and so on. But if you want to have a livable city, if you want to have a city with a high density, we have really to think about two important things. We need a transport system where the transport modes, it's not especially about public transport, fulfill two requirements. The first one is we need at least space as possible, and we produce at least as emissions as possible, noise emissions as well as all other emissions like CO2, NOx, and all the shit. And if you have such a big picture, you have to think about what could be the best, what's affordable for your city. For example, I would say for most countries from the global south, a public transport system like we can see in Vienna, or we have in Vienna, it's not affordable. It would be too much to build such an impressive underground system. Of course, maybe it's easier to build cycling lanes or to build bus rapid transit systems, especially if you have much lower labor costs. When it could be a better strategy, of course. And you really should focus on these two things. And there's a question around this last and first mile problem. That's an interesting discussion, because it's a discussion we have in 6 or 7 years, I would say, in this industry. Until then, it was not really an important discussion. We at Civity really believe in two main features of public transport. The first one is about inclusiveness, so that public transport is for people from in the outer areas or somewhere on the countryside. It's the gate to the world, so it leads to connectivity overall. There's one feature we can establish with public transport. This is very, very expensive, to be honest, and it's something for very rich countries. On the other side, public transport, and that's the most important feature, it's all about mass rapid transit. So to bring many people at the same time through the same corridor. And then public transport can really utilize their central USP. We have to bring as most as people possible through the same corridor at the same time. And if this happens, if this is possible, when we can, we can use public transport as most efficient, and we can solve the problems in our cities. And if we then think about other transport demands, when we have really to think about cycling, walking, how we can improve that, and we can use cycling, walking instead of public transport.
So you would say that also from a perspective of looking at the size and the density and the budget of the city, it might make sense to look at other modes first.
Sure.
Than following the Vienna examples. There's a few questions here that kind of go along the same line. One, is there a way to make, also, I mean, we're talking a lot about public transport in a crisis now due to the COVID pandemic. Is there a way to provide really good mobility system, not necessarily public transport for the people, that is more self-sufficient in financial terms? Do you have any thoughts on that?
More self-sufficient in fiscal terms?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. When you have to be very careful with rail-bound systems. So rail-bound systems need a lot of capital expenditures, and they are always expensive. And if you see, especially in countries which have not that experience with rail-bound systems, it's more important to look on the cost side, because in these countries it's quite expensive. So what's the problem about all that? The cost issue or the budget issue. In the end, we have two important cost categories in public transport. First of all, it's as I've already mentioned, it's capital expenditures and it's labor cost. So. And you can be as much as flexible with your size of vehicles, or you can as much as granular with public transport if the labor costs are low. So there's a reason why this informal demand responsive transportation, as we call it now in industrialized or in cities of the global north, it's already known in most cities in Africa or in Latin America or in Turkey or in Southeast Asia now, everywhere. But it's possible because you have self-employed drivers, no social security scheme, and you can scale this type of solution very easily. And that's completely different to Western Europe or to North America. And that makes a completely different situation for public transport planner in the global south. So you can really utilize this tool with self-employed drivers and to increase the supply side and the flexibility of public transport. And that's really an advantage for them. So we have a disadvantage with have not the budgets for building large, impressive mass rapid transit systems. But on the other side, they can use much more flexible systems. I think the important thing about that is that you have always this long-term picture in mind, and you have to know what happens if public transport at this end, for example, supports economic development, and public transport is definitely one of the most important success factors for public development, for economic development. What you really can see in China, that China is really now a rail country. They have built many railways during the last 2 decades, and they're building them impressively fast. And the whole country is not built on cars, like, for example, southern US or other parts of the Middle East. It's really built on railway systems. They have done the same like the Europeans in the end of the 19th century. They built impressive railway systems. And that's a big question, especially, I guess, for Latin America and Africa. We have to think about in which state you are, and you have now to decide which system. So it's really a system decision question, which system you will have maybe in 40, 50, or 100 years. And you have to reflect on that issue. And when you can decide, this is our path, this is our trajectory we have to walk on, and when we have to build the system from scratch.
Interesting. And of course, the labor costs are vastly different there. Do you have any take on whether Vienna, and in comparison to other cities that you're working with, is well equipped in terms of staff, and both in terms of the planning staff, but also in terms of investing resources in redesigning the infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. I would say on this side, they have a lot of staff, they have high qualified staff, and they are cutting edge in this area, both planning and redesigning infrastructure. They have an impressive track record. That's not the problem in Vienna. The problem in Vienna is more the shortage of, I would say, to be honest, simple educated staff. So we have drivers. The drivers are really the shortage in Vienna, and that's really a problem. And we have a massive increase in the demand for drivers due to the impressive increase in public transport supply. So, and on the same side, we have really a shortage in the labor market on this side, and to find qualified drivers. And that's not a problem only in Europe. It's a problem in the whole Western Europe, I would say.
Interesting. And as it refers to in the title of your presentation, making public transport attractive. So the question here would be, how can we, or do you have any thoughts on how this could be made more attractive for drivers or for potential drivers, also in the wake of times where maybe not everyone is keen on being super exposed in public?
Yeah, that's really a story. And again, Vienna this was quite fast in that. The next generation of buses in Vienna will have a closed box for the driver, for example. So that would be, so there's no direct contact between the driver and the passengers. So it's quite safe for the driver. And we can see this already for trams, and of course it's obvious for the underground service. So if you compare public transport systems in German-speaking countries with other systems, we have already a very low amount of staff in cars and in stations. So it's already to a large part automized and self-service, and that leads not to, it's not really a challenge for them to protect staff for COVID-19 or other possible diseases. So I would say it's a story, it's an image story for public transport and hygiene to be a safe place for passengers. That's very, very important. But again, I would say we are on a good path. It was a little bit challenging the last 8 weeks, but this is not the struggle. It's, in the end, it's really an image, a question of image, but it's not from an operational perspective.
Okay. Maybe come into the final questions. You said at some point it's a little bit of a legend, this huge increase in the sale of annual fare tickets, and that it was made attractive for everybody. Have you done an analysis of specific groups that have been particularly responsive to this annual ticket now that with a reduced fare? Is there certain groups that are super prone to using it versus others that are still excluded the same way?
Yeah, to make it, I guess I mentioned already one. This is the so-called 8 Tage Klimatage customer. So that is a leisure users which are using public transport at Saturdays to go to the city and to shop, yeah, for example, or go to the theater. But for commuting, they're using something else, a cycle, car, or something else. So they are really transformed, and I think this is a good part of the story, because they are transformed from a non-frequent user to at least to a frequent user pass holder, and they've increased their ridership. That's true. And of course we have, and this is also again connected with the downside of the story, we have a so-called summer cycler, which are using the cycle in the summer, and they've bought prior to the introduction of the annual pass, with very cheap annual pass and monthly tickets during the winter season. And they, of course, now have also an annual pass, and it's more attractive for them also to use public transport on rainy days during the summer season. And yeah, this also, to make it more easy understandable, this is the two most important groups. So the one group which is using not frequently public transport, but each month, a few days, and the other important group is which use public transport heavily a few months per year, and both groups have migrated to annual passes heavily, and they have also increased ridership. That's true. And all other users which have this cheaper annual pass, they have to pay less, let's be honest.
Okay, are they would you say we can draw conclusions for the global perspective from Vienna's users in terms of price sensitivity, in terms of how they like the public transport? Is it the model in terms of its reliability and frequency? Something that
it's definitely a question of
changed?
Frequency. It's definitely a question of frequency that you have. If you have not, so they have no, on most lines, especially on underground lines and the most important tram lines, they have no timetable. There's only stated every 2 to 3 minutes trains will depart. So it's all about, I have not to think about the timetable. I have to go to the station. I can walk up on the next train, or on the next bus, or on the next tram. That's what's one part of the story. It's all about frequency. And the second part, you've asked about price elasticity. And what we have done prior to the introduction of this 365 annual pass was a large market research project. And we have figured out that the majority of the population of Vienna had the opinion that the annual pass at 449 euro was already quite cheap if you compare it to the supply side offered. So what we can learn from Vienna is that people, or the population, is valuing a good, extensive public transport supply side. And if you compare it to the negative example, let's say call me Hamburg a negative example. Of course, if your annual pass costs 100,000 euro, and you've seen the bad KPIs for the public transport supply side, then there's really a lot of frustration and angriness against public transport and against the top management and the political decision makers, because they think it's too expensive for this type of quality, this kind of quality. And that's completely different in Vienna. Everybody, if you're talking to somebody in Vienna, nobody is arguing that the public transport, the cost of public transport are too high, or that the quality is bad. Nobody is doing this. So this is really, if the quality is good, the price is okay, they love the system and they use it.
And this will stay the same for users now after we come out of this pandemic situation?
That's an interesting question, and this is a little bit to look in the we have to look in the future, and we are thinking about different scenarios. So I would say we need at least 1 or 2 years if we are until we are back on the on the level of January 2020. And I would suggest, or my hypothesis is, that we will be in Vienna much faster than, for example, in Hamburg. And this is also to do with the USP of public transport. It's the most competitive mode of transportation in Vienna, and people are really relying on public transport, and that's completely different in Hamburg, for example, where it's much more convenient to go by car. And so I would suggest, if your public transport side is good and you have this attractive settlement density and all the other conditions, we will quite faster recover from this COVID-19 crisis than in other cities.
Okay, thank you. I notice we're out of time here, and you've covered a huge ground of questions. Thank you very much, Friedemann, and thank you everyone online who shared their questions with us. We will also make them available after the presentation, as well as a recording of this presentation and the slides. And we're happy to share that in a follow-up email with you. Thank you very much for your participation. Do not miss out on our TUMI TV event in 2 weeks. And thank you. Stay safe and sound.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.